Hello and welcome to the BSI webinar on food fraud with guest speakers from Science. We have a packed agenda today on our food fraud webinar, including an introduction to BSI and Science, food fraud, the cost, the criminals and the consequences, a little bit about the pandemic and Brexit, along with some testing methods and a nice summary of actions to take. Your first presenter is Richard Werron, who is the Food and Retail Supply Chain Director from BSI, and your presenters from FERA are James Donarski, Head of Food Authenticity, and Adrian Charlton, who is the Principal Scientist at FERA. So over to you, Richard, now for a little bit about BSI.
Thank you very much indeed, Erica. And I'd like to add a personal warm welcome to fellow foodies around the world on this webinar today. And there's a lot of material to get through, and I hope you'll find this webinar interesting and thought-provoking. So we'll go fast where we can and slow where we need to. So BSI, we're a Royal Charter company. And what does that mean? It means we're a non-profit distributing company. We invest all our profits back into our Royal Charter mandate, which is about harmonizing and standardizing, improving performance, sustainability, and facilitating international trade. We were founded in 1901, and we have more than 4,000 employees employed across more than 90 offices in 193 countries. And BSI originated 9 out of the top 10 voluntary adopted business standards on the planet, such as ISO 9000, 14000, 45, and 27,000 for information security. And moving on, in response to industry demand to independently verify a customer promise, we launched the Kite Mark Food Assurance Program just 3 months ago. It's been the most successful global food product launch ever that integrates auditing best practice, verified supply chain nodes, sampling and testing with our science partner, FERA. Over to you, Adrian.
Science Limited is based in York in the north of England. We were originally part of the UK government and born out of what was effectively the Ministry of Agriculture several years ago, and now known as DEFRA. DEFRA retain a large shareholding within the organisation, but we're now a joint venture with a company called Capita. Right? The main aim of FERA has always been to protect the food supply chain and to protect the environment in which food's produced as well. And we've gone into partnership with BSI to look at how we can develop some of the testing capability that we have at FERA and produce robust standards for the food industry that support our mission statement of protecting the food chain and the natural environment.
Good, thank you, Adrian. So before we get into food fraud, it's important to bear in mind that what this is really about, and that's being able to tell your supply chain story. Because if you can't tell your supply chain story, somebody else will, and the chances are it won't be good. So moving forward, food fraud, the cost, the criminals, and the consequences. A quick reminder, and there's a definition from food fraud here taken from PAS 96, the dishonest act or omission relating to the production or supply of food which is intended for personal gain or to cause loss to another party. Interestingly, Frederick Ackerman's treatise in 1820 on food adulteration, as you can see on the right-hand side, lists olive oil, bread, beer, wine, spirits, and so on. So nothing's really changed in 200 years except sophistication and scale driven by greed. Moving on. At best, the consequence for a food manufacturer, brand, or retailer is a complaint or a refund. But more serious and bigger frauds damage consumer loyalty and cause lasting reputational brand damage. Moving forward, I'm sure most people on this webinar today will be familiar with the 7 types of fraud, and they're well documented. You know, for example, blending cheaper ingredients into products to extend them, and in some cases, as we shall see, the combination of several food fraud types all at one time. Moving on. Europol is the EU's law enforcement agency to combat international organized crime, and Operation Opson is an ongoing Europol-Interpol joint operation counterfeiting, really targeting counterfeit products, substandard food and beverages. And this ongoing operation for many years now has been targeting, particularly this year, organic food products, coffee and other commodities like saffron. And fake documentation, which has been prevalent in all of these cases. So we've seen 19 organized crime groups dismantled, over 400 suspects being arrested, with the most products being seized are alcoholic beverages and some animal food products. Moving forward, this is an interesting one that happened just a few months ago, and this is whereby low quality wines were refilled into the bottles under original labels and then sold as the real thing on big online auction platforms. And the wines were sold in Belgium, France, all over the world, in the USA, and some of these wines went for $1,000 a bottle and netted the criminals a huge amount of money. Moving forward, in Bulgaria, 320 tons of smuggled or substandard dairy products which posed a health risk was seized, along with 210 tons of cheese that was incorrectly PGO labeled, and last but not least, 3.6 tons of unsafe dairy products which were due to be processed into melted cheese, and these were all taken off the market. I'm sure we can remember this one just 5 years ago. This was the largest recall of an allergen in a spice. It implicated 700 products and was recalled by 40 food manufacturers and retailers, and that was just in the USA. There was speculation about the source, but it implicated Turkey and India. And India produces 80% of cumin and was probably the upshot of a failed cumin harvest that year. The levels of peanut husk ranged up to 10%. So in, say, 10 tons of cumin, that would have yielded an additional $4,000 of profit. Now, unlike the last example, this is an interesting incident that happened in Africa that you may not have heard of. This was a very successful product, but for all the wrong reasons. A mislabeled energy drink that contained Viagra, which gave rise to unexpected side effects, and that created a health hazard, and it was duly removed from the market. This report popped up just yesterday, and it was a report about the mislabeled Chinese conventional raspberries being shipped to Canada via Chile, where they were relabeled as organic. The scam involved more than 25 people, and because it dodged levies and tariffs, also the fact that the product was mislabeled as organic, which meant it could fetch premium prices, netted the criminals about $12 million. Disturbingly, the same Chinese source that supplied Canada directly previously in the past was implicated in a norovirus outbreak that caused hundreds of people to be sick. So this entire scam turned on the presentation of fake documentation, bills of lading, etc. So moving on, I think we have a poll.
Yes, thanks, Richard. So now is the time where we ask that you share your opinions in our poll. So you should see on the screen there what percentage of companies verify the authenticity of documents received by suppliers. So yeah, just to get your opinions on this one, because I'm sure Richard will have the correct answer for you after the poll, but we'll see what the knowledge base is like on the group now. So I'd say we can close that off now and share the results with you. So very interesting. Can you see those, Richard?
Yes, I can. That is quite remarkable. Yes. Okay. Moving on then, Erica. So yes, the average company has 89 suppliers, and each site manages about 50 key documents. 82% of companies rely on information coming in from suppliers by email, but only half of those companies actually bother to validate the documents they receive. So you can see there's an opportunity for fake documents just to slip through, particularly in this time of COVID, where there's been much less scrutiny and enforcement activity. But like the previous example with raspberries, documents have value. So where to check this documentation? Now, many organizations on the webinar here today will quite rightly wish to advertise their commitment to quality and food safety and put their full-sized FSSC, SQF or BRC certificate on their website. I can tell you this is a fraudster's dream. Give me 10 minutes and Photoshop and I can create a new certificate that would have changed dates, grades, etc., all presented in a shiny new PDF. So do check the documentation with the certification program owner's website. It just takes a minute, and make sure you have a robust document control in place. Moving forward. This one often escapes people's attention about how fraudsters can exploit the situation. Wi-Fi network access and IoT devices present huge and ongoing risks, and it makes sense to be cautious about connecting systems, your systems, with external suppliers and companies. Indeed, there are efficiency gains to be had by doing this, but you're also presenting yourself to a risk from hacking. So whilst you're evaluating product risk, it really does make sense to evaluate the risk that suppliers present to you regarding their IT vulnerabilities. And a great starting point here is actually PAS 96. The good news is this PAS, sponsored by the UK Department of Agriculture, sorry, the UK Department of Environment and Rural Affairs and the Food Standards Agency, is free to download from our website. So this is an update. The 2017 is the current version, and all of the updates over the previous 2014 version are all to do with cyber. And it's a great document to present at board to really get their attention about the exposure that you may have running from cyber. Moving forward, this is an interesting one. Now, criminals will attack the weakest link, and it's known that the weakest link in the food production supply chain is the transport and logistics network. And here's an example of exploitation, and it's called fake pickups. And here's how it works. Once the transport company has been hacked, criminals upload fake documentation, bills of lading, all sorts of collection notes, things like this, into the transport company's systems, and then arrange for the stolen or fake products to be collected by the legitimate supply chain. So this is how these products can actually get injected into the legitimate chain. Moving forward then, Erica, the pandemic effect. Let's go forward again, please, Erica. Thank you. So what we've seen are consumers, you, me, and everybody, just requiring to shop just once a week like people did in the 1970s, and doing a big chop every time. And that really encouraged people to panic buy and stockpiling. And there was a shift, of course, to online buying, supported with home deliveries. We also saw that social media platforms became an informal sales channel, combined with retailer rationing. Moving on. Food manufacturers and processors really had to concentrate on their main product lines during this time, and to an extent they're still having to do so. Immediately we saw stock that was bottled up in the food service outlets being diverted into food manufacturers and processors, but they too also suffered from depleted human resources, people that were unfortunately ill or were shielding, and also feeding into that reduced transportation and logistics capabilities. The procurement teams were also having to draw from or under pressure to draw from untried and maybe even untested suppliers. In our particular area of food assurance, over the last 6 months, we've seen fewer third and second party audits from retailers. Third party scheme certificates have simply been extended with reduced regulatory enforcement oversight globally. And we've seen the introduction of remote audits, or immersive audits as we call them at BSI, particularly by retailers. Across all sectors this year, and I'm including here automotive, built environment, medical, and aerospace, 71,000 audits, 71,000 immersive audits we've carried out across the globe. And we call them immersive because we immerse ourselves in the client's world. And for those other sectors, particularly high-risk ones like medical and aerospace, immersive audits have been the norm for years. Thank you. So, just in time, COVID has really tested food sector resilience, and just in time is a concept that came out of 1970s manufacturing and was perfected by Toyota to maximize output and efficiency and designed to meet market demands. The food sector adopted much the same principles with little or no supply chain buffering. What COVID did was create those demand shocks, leaving companies ill-equipped to cope with the surge with no backup stock. New supply networks emerged with a demand surge for processing, auxiliaries and sanitizers and disinfectants. And this prompted us to kite mark the world's first industrially available hand sanitizer, which you may have seen. Moving forward. One thing we did find out from this episode, and we're not through it yet, we're still coming through COVID at different speeds around the world, was that companies that have viable management systems have done much better than those that either have them or don't use them properly. And we've seen a demand surge in organizational resilience, BS 65,000, pre-supplier qualification, another great PAS, freely available from BSI, PAS 7000. And information security, no surprises there, as everything's gone online, with companies willing to put in much more robust information systems with ISO 27000, and procurement teams really wanting to install collaborative business relationships with suppliers and with their clients as well, with ISO 44,000.
Great, thanks, Richard. So yes, this is our next interactive poll, and the question will be available for you to vote on now. So we'll see what the audience thinks on what effect might the pandemic have had on food fraud. Do you think that food fraud has increased due to the pandemic? Do you think that it's stayed the same? Or do you think that it's decreased? Or are you looking perhaps that it will increase, stay the same, or decrease? So we've got a very high voter turnout today. It seems like most people are actually voting, which is great to see because we get a good representation of the people on the call. So yes, I think we'll close the poll off now, and
Wow.
You should be able to see on the screen there. Yeah, 86% think that the pandemic has increased food fraud. Can the presenters provide any feedback on their knowledge of this?
Yeah, well, in spite of what everyone might have read, there's actually currently no reliable data to prove an increase in fraud at the moment. So one might say that it's currently stayed the same, but like the raspberry incident, it takes between 12 and 18 months for it to surface. So if this time next year there's been no problem, then as a sector we've succeeded. But you can see that all the indicators are in fact increased risk. Sometimes bad things have to happen for good to come forward. And one of the good things that has happened is that COVID has really advanced our sector, which has lagged so far behind other sectors, particularly aerospace, medical and automotive. And here we can see that new technology has been proven, and that has really brought things right up to date. Thanks, Erica. Moving on. Now, immersive audits, as we go forward, immersive audits will become normal. And as things settle down, which inevitably they will, it will evolve to be a blended audit between a physical and a remote audit. What we've discovered from our experience in food already and with other sectors, that both the auditor and the auditee really do like remote audits and settle into them and adapt to them very quickly. And the last point there is that, of course, training is just as important as it ever was, and that's adapted to a virtual delivery platform. And the ones that we operate actually have breakout sessions that are managed with invigilation for examinations for delegates to test understanding. Let's move on. Brexit. Well, no presentation today is you can avoid the dreaded B word, which is impacting the United Kingdom and elsewhere across our friends in the European Union. And moving forward, I think the poll might occur now.
Yes, so we'll see whether our audience today has many opinions on how they think Brexit might have an impact on food fraud. So there's obviously a lot of impacts that Brexit may have, but are we looking at an increase in food fraud or not, do we think? And then we'll go back to Richard for his feedback and the rest of the presentation.
Good, thank you, Erica. That's very interesting. So at best, the influence of Brexit increases the level of fraud, and there's certainly opportunity for exploitation there. But the point I'd like to make on this particular slide is that food manufacturers and brands are very concerned about the financial risks presented by Brexit, because there's going to be new taxes, new tariffs, and of course currency exposure, which nobody can predict. And alongside this, there are going to be new registrations required, more paperwork and licenses required to both import and export. Moving forward. Thank you. So manufacturers are actually caught in the middle. On one side, retailers are exerting very strong downward price pressure to maintain competitiveness on food manufacturers, but at the same time they're also experiencing increasing raw material pressure from suppliers, and that's not just ingredients. All types of goods and services are increasing. So this is not a good place to be, and food manufacturers are trying to insulate themselves from price increases by engaging with suppliers to really encourage them to take on their exposure and risk, hold buffer stock to buy time, and in some cases even agree to absorb any new taxes and or trade tariffs. And some may do so, but it may be much more difficult for others, and some that do may later on regret it and create a situation where blending and adulteration of food ingredients might occur. Detecting fraud and moving forward again. Thank you. So this is really coming down into a very few basics here, and the important thing is to develop an anti-fraud culture within the business, asking questions like who has sign off for contracts. Is it more than one person that can actually sign off a purchasing contract? And this comes down to having good governance. Installing anti-fraud staff training, very important, and very important to not only to do refresher training, but install anti-fraud training at induction. Coming to the rescue here is ISO 37001, another ISO standard that you may like to pick up on this one, which is all about installing anti-bribery management systems. But let's not forget those staff within the business who routinely handle samples, because they have an innate sense to flag up something when something appears different. And last but definitely not least, procurement teams, they have the knowledge. They will also be aware of price shocks and provide any kind of insight that might be going on from a commercial aspect. So moving forward, from our experience, fraud usually takes two. In the case of the raspberry incident, it took actually 24 people. But spotting internal fraud can be quite tricky and can be revealed through financial audits, mass balances, listening to whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are very often the source of useful information about what's going on, but also looking for extravagant lifestyles that staff may suddenly be going on to having very long and expensive holidays in rather nice places, which might be a little out of character. So it's really keeping your antenna up for what may be going on. And this really, the message of this is to say, well, yes, companies can think that food fraud is out there and is something that happens to them, but sometimes fraud is internal as well. Moving forward, business intelligence is very important, and the key thing here is to get early warnings about what is going on through RASFF, which people I'm sure will know about, which is the European Union's database, Ferrous Horizon Scan, or our own BSI screen. These are extremely useful tools, and as you can see here, counterfeit pistachio seeds, and that was back in September when I picked that one up, that you may not have heard about. But these are things that are very useful to bring up and discuss with the procurement teams and with suppliers. But the key thing here is to sign up to a selection of reliable resources. Moving forward. Now, sometimes we see sensationalist headlines, and it's very important to really try and get behind that. And the way to do that is to cross-reference information from various databases. And it's interesting, actually, just to stay alert to what issues competitors actually experience. So if they've had any incidents, and this helps to drive that wisdom and that intelligence out of the information gathering from the data that you can accumulate. Techniques to detect fraud, and that's over to you, James.
Thank you, Richard. So as was introduced at the beginning of the presentation, my name is James Tadarsky. I'm the Head of Food Authenticity at Ferroscience Limited, and I'd like to use this bit of the webinar to cover some of the appropriate approaches for the detection of food fraud. Now, earlier in the webinar, Richard defined food fraud and listed that there are a large number of frauds that can be committed on a product. And Adrian is going to go into a specific example of one commodity after I finish presenting. But actually, all foods are susceptible to food fraud, and therefore a variety of tools are needed. It's sort of a toolbox, which is what I'm going to try and cover in the next few slides. So, as Richard has already alluded to start with, data is your friend. Data is really important, and those of you that undertake VASAP assessments will already be aware of using databases to determine historical frauds in products to make sure that that's a good place to start your mitigation strategy. There's also sector business intelligence that Richard's already mentioned. In the UK, there's the Food Industry Intelligence Network, and it's important to share information like this regarding fraud, because fraud is actually it's a non-competitive thing. If a fraud event happens in one part, for one company in a commodity, the whole commodity group will feel the effects of it. When horse meat happened in 2013, the whole sector saw decreased sales volumes. So it's important to remember that data is really helpful there. Also, again, as Richard has mentioned, most companies will have a procurement team, and the procurement team will actually be aware of early warnings that are going to be coming because they'll impact them for their prices, but actually these can be joined up because these are going to be early warning signs for frauds that are going to happen. If there is going to be a poor harvest, that means that the prices of a particular commodity are going to be increased, and that's going to be a driver for fraud. So there's a lot of information already out there that you can use to set your scene for what sort of frauds you need to be concerned about and what sort of mitigation you need to put in place. Now, I'm going to talk in the next slide as I talk about DNA and RNA and then some other things on about some particular approaches that you can take. So starting with DNA and RNA, most of you will be aware that DNA and RNA is the blueprint of life. Everything that is living has a copy of DNA inside it. And therefore, if you are concerned that your product is being adulterated, contaminated with something that's biological in nature, then actually DNA testing is a good place to start. Now, in my slide there, I've listed 3 different types of DNA testing that you can do. That's not an exhaustive list. These are just specific examples. Now, the first one there, the PCR testing, this is an example of something called a targeted testing technology. So this is where you take your sample and you do analysis and you say, right, is horse meat present in my sample? And you'll get a yes/no answer, but it will only detect what you ask it to look for. And that's something you need to be aware of when you do targeted testing. The second technology I've discussed there, LAMP, is an example of portable testing solutions. So PCR testing, the first one, is something that would happen in a laboratory and you need quite a large investment, or you need to be sending it off to testing labs to do that. Whereas LAMP is something that you can install in a factory site. It's the technology is this testing equipment is probably the size of a couple of shoe boxes. It's not that huge, to be honest, and it's quite easy. You get a rapid answer within 30 minutes. And then the next example I've given there, this next generation sequencing, this is how quite a lot of testing is going, and you'll hear me talk about this sort of testing in the next couple of slides. This is something called non-targeted testing. So this is non-targeted DNA testing. You do an extraction in your sample, you look at all the DNA you can extract from your sample and analyze, and then you get an awful lot of data out, and then use bioinformatic tools to identify anything that's in your sample that you're not expecting. And this is a great type of method for when you're looking for unexpected frauds. Now, I'm not going to cover, because I don't have time, some of the other considerations that you need to think of, but this is appropriate for all the testing I want to cover about, is you need to give consideration to what your false positive results are. That means how many times will you put a sample through that is not adulterated, but your testing will say it's adulterated, because that's really important, because it can really impact on supplier relationships, because you're going to be going back to that supplier and saying, where to say, I've analysed something and it's fraudulent when it isn't. So you need to be aware of false positives. You need to be aware about false negatives. How good is the test? How many times will it actually a fraudulent sample set through it? And you need to be aware about cost, turnaround. And I'm not going to cover any of this in the rest of the talk, because I just really don't have time to cover it. But there are lots of things you need to consider with testing. So if we talk on to the next slide, DNA testing is great if you've got something biological in your sample. but actually DNA is not always the most appropriate technology. So things like an egg only has one copy of DNA in it, so therefore it can be quite hard to get the detection limits you need. And some of the processing that can happen in food production can actually destroy the DNA. DNA is quite a delicate molecule, and therefore, as much as DNA is the barcode of life, protein is pretty much the workhorse of life. And you'll find that proteins are present in biological systems, and they do a lot of the enzymes, the chemical, the things that do the work in cells, and they're usually a lot more stable, and they also can be species specific, and you can use them as detection strategies as well. So if DNA is not going to work for you because you've got highly processed products, you might want to look down to protein testing. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but there are examples of targeted protein testing. Is there horse meat in there? You can go for non-targeted testing, something called shotgun proteomics, and you can even do portable testing. So things like ELISA technology, if anybody's heard of ELISAs, they're based on protein technologies. So those are two good examples for what happens if you have a biological concern. But moving on to chemical testing, you'll find that often that there isn't a biological element. So if your compound has got added water, if you're concerned about melamine, if you remember the melamine scare from 2008, and there's a structure of melamine in the bottom right corner, or if you want to know what's the level of CBD in your oil, is your manuka honey active enough, these are all specific chemicals, so therefore you need to move on to chemical testing. And again, there's a whole variety of different ways of doing chemical testing. I'm not going to go through all of them. In fact, I'm not even going to really go much further than mentioning a couple of my favorites, which is NMR and LCMS. But what you need to be doing with that is picking the most appropriate testing. And you've got targeted testing, is melamine present? You've got non-targeted testing, where again, you take a fingerprint of your product, you define what it looks like when it's normal, and then when you receive new samples, you challenge them against this database to see if there's anything different in them. And finally, smaller than chemicals, you've got atoms. If you remember your GCSE chemistry or your GCSE physics, atoms are the building blocks of chemicals. Atoms contain protons and neutrons, and we're using some pretty sophisticated analysis. You can do analysis to work out the differences in neutron ratios in chemicals, and that gives you information, and I'm not going to explain why at this point, but it gives you information that can be tied back to geographical origin of samples. It can be used to differentiate grass-fed versus corn-fed, and it can even be used to differentiate synthetic from natural. So again, if these are the sort of questions that you're going to have to ask, then these are the technologies that you can use. So I wanted to wrap up there. Actually, you need a variety of techniques for the toolbox. And what I always say when people are asking me about what's the most appropriate technology is, you need to look at what you are concerned about, find out what is the thing that you think is going to be adulterating your sample, and build a testing strategy around that. There's an awful lot of testing out there, but you always need to make sure that you pick that's most appropriate for you. So now I'm going to move on to pass it on to Adrian.
Okay, thanks, James. That was a great setup for me to talk about specific risks that are associated with products at the moment. And whilst we've seen that there have been various issues with lots of different commodities, and things like honey and oil adulteration have been very high profile. But this time post-COVID and moving into a post-Brexit era as well, there are going to be specific things that come up as particular challenges. So on the next slide, we'll talk about some of these, and they include things that are associated with health. Obviously, COVID has highlighted to many people that there are some gaps in our medical armory, and a lot of people have turned to things like food supplements and even products that are associated with improving health. So we talk about vitamins and supplements, but there are also other beneficial oils, for example, or manuka honey sales. They've gone up significantly during the COVID period as people try to find ways of protecting their health and preventing themselves from becoming infected with COVID-19 through whatever means they feel helps them. But that does leave an opportunity available for people who are likely to commit food fraud to supplement in cheaper products, different types of oil, different types of honey, just the plain white powder in place of your vitamins, whatever that might be, or even down to some of the other things that we've heard Richard talk about, just a change in the label, putting something on a label that just isn't true. And whilst we have the methods to be able to fight those, it's the application of all those methods together that will give us the full picture. So On the next slide, I'm going to introduce CBD, actually, which is one of the other emerging risks. It's a risk because it's just coming into the market, really. It's that CBD it stands for cannabidiol, which is it's the extract of the hemp plant, which is related to marijuana, but it doesn't contain the psychoactive components. And it's coming into the market now, and there's a lot of uptake, particularly in the food industry, with people wanting to use this as an ingredient in foods. It's associated with reducing anxiety without having psychoactive effects. So it turns a relatively straightforward product, a chocolate bar or a soft drink, into a premium product where people and consumers in particular have a high demand for CBD. Now that's a perfect storm in terms of creating a food fraud environment. You've got a very popular product, you've got a new market that isn't particularly well educated, you've got a lack of regulation in certain sectors as well that's only just catching up. So what can we do, and where are we now with CBD? I'll introduce this on the next slide. And one of the things that has come to our attention, and we've been working very closely with the regulators, is that there is an awareness that some of the products that are already on the market, so CBD is up for sale, even though technically it shouldn't be because there's some licensing aspects around the novel foods process to go through first, that there are products for sale in the UK. And we know that some of the producers are not disclosing everything that they need to in terms of content, and they're not using analytical methods that are appropriate for policing the system. So the detection limits are not low enough, the accuracy of the measurements is not consistent enough, and we'll see some examples of that over the next few slides. But what we really need to do is to determine the true content of these products so that we can develop a control system. Next slide, please. Now, one of the issues really, and one of the real benefits, we're talking about this from a fraud perspective, but this is a real success story really. CBD has been very much considered within a range of different sectors, and food is just one of them. I've mentioned soft beverages and chocolate bars, granola, that sort of thing that people are putting CBD into, but it's going into a wide range of things. Oils and capsules are probably the most popular, and these are considered to be food supplements at the moment. But also other areas that are regulated very differently include cosmetics and vape products. People putting CBD oils into vape is a popular route, and we're also seeing it getting infused into bandages and put into various other different products. So there's a wide range of different products that will be impacted. Next slide, please. And we've been looking at the different products, and particularly with a focus on foods, but we have certainly been looking in the other sectors as well. One of the major issues is the CBD content. So the oils and the capsules are sold with a percentage of CBD in there, which is, as I said, the cannabidiol, the actual active component in there, and it may be labelled up as 10% CBD. But what we're finding when we measure this in the laboratory, we can buy the same product from 3 different outlets, and we'll get 3 different results for the content of CBD. And that looks like it's a homogeneity issue. That might be down to manufacturing processes, it might be down to blending, or it might be down to fraud. We just don't know that, but we do know there is an issue in the marketplace with the homogeneity. And we use the methods that James spoke about to be able to look at that. Mass spectrometry in particular helps us to work out the CBD content. We've also found, given that CBD is extracted from hemp, and hemp is relatively easy to grow, and it's used for decontaminating land. So in various parts of the world, if you've got problems with environmental pollutants, then growing hemp actually removes some of those from the soil to allow you to use that land for agricultural products. And that means that the environmental contaminants will build up inside the hemp, and subsequently will get extracted into the CBD products if you are buying those kind of hemp plants that have been used for remediation. So we found in particular polyaromatic hydrocarbons in hemp-based products, and we're also very concerned about things like heavy metals. And whilst this is not necessarily a fraud, it's a reuse of a product that isn't fit for its purpose. So it's considered to be an illegal process to use hemp that's been used for bioremediation within the food sector. So how do we get around that? Well, the main way of doing this at the moment, with the regulations will be coming in different sectors. The Food Standards Agency in particular are proactive in the novel foods area. There's an awful lot of guidance out there, but it's not everything is in place at the moment in terms of closing the loop on anything that might provide a risk if CBD is in your supply chain. So what we've done, we've launched the Food Assurance Kite Mark, which is a standardization program which links the testing that James has talked about, some of the auditing that Richard's spoken about, into a solution that allows the food chain in particular to be very much reassured that they have access to everything that's needed to make sure that food fraud is prevented or at least minimized. And we've launched this year. Next slide, please. And one of the reasons that we think this is important is to protect products that have a very strong regional basis or have a risk of fraud. And so we've chosen Scottish heather honey to launch the product off the back of, and it's been a very successful launch. We've developed auditing methods to show that the honey's from Scotland, and we've developed some of the testing methods to prove that it's from heather. Some of the things that we've heard about, the NMR and what have you, is used to prove that the honey predominantly comes from one nectar source. And there are regulations that apply to determine whether it's honey and whether it meets the specification of being honey. And there are also methods that apply to be able to detect things like sugar adulteration, which is common within honey. And with all those checks and balances in place, and with the strong branding that the BSI have got around the Kite Mark, then Scottish heather honey from the Scottish Bee Company, at the very least, has been awarded the Kite Mark to prove that they are doing all of the right things to minimise the opportunity of food fraud. And on that note, I'll pass that back to Erica, because I think this is very much for BSI to continue talking about their Kite Mark.
Brilliant, thanks Adrian. And yeah, it's really good to see the partnership between BSI and FERA on the Kite Mark to have that robust testing, and then obviously the brand recognition of the Kite Mark to bring the Scottish Bee Company that benefit. And of course, listeners on this can buy Scottish Bee Company's honey that is Kite marked and get it delivered. And just to give you a little bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar with the Kite Mark itself, who maybe aren't in a market where it's so prevalent, certainly in the UK market, the Kite Mark's recognised by 82% of the UK adult population, and almost 78%, so almost 80% of 18 to 24-year-olds. So I think for new novel products like you've spoken about with CBD and other products that may be susceptible to food fraud, the Kite Mark with testing combined might be something that is quite beneficial for new brands out there. And of course, we all know the usual suspects of food fraud on the screen now, with things like olive oil, fish, alcohols, etc. But of course, any product can be subject to food fraud. And I think on that we'll go back to Richard for some final considerations and conclusions before we finish up on our Q&A and our final poll.
Good, thank you, Erica. Yes, there's quite a number of considerations that we'd like you to take away from this that you may find very helpful and useful. I'll just pick out a few things here. We would recommend that spot buying is prohibited and really give preference to vertically integrated suppliers and maybe increase scrutiny of products that you receive from importers and distributors. And of course, apply PAS 96. It's available to you. Why not use it? And build that into an anti-fraud culture within the business. Again, download and employ PAS 7000. For those of you that have got VASP, risk assess those suppliers and make sure that you're trying to build collaborative relationships with suppliers and know who you are really dealing with, and to really drive at that supply chain transparency whilst evaluating the IT risk that suppliers present. So with existing suppliers, this is some considerations here. When I first went into the food industry, I had the pleasure of working with a guy who was close to retirement, and he gave me two pieces of advice. Don't wait for faults to become problems, and to go to problems before they come to you. So if you have specific concerns with suppliers, go to them now. Make sure specifications are up to date, and calibrate sampling and testing frequency with risk. And don't forget to verify those documents or authenticities. Moving forward. Now, there's some early warning signs here. And that's all about spotting unusual supplier behavior. And ask yourself, why and what might have changed when they're ringing you about saying, well, we can't deliver, or can we have additional time, or they're not responding like they used to, or you're finding yourself having to chase incomplete or missing supplier documentation, and maybe they're bringing something unusual that they haven't brought to you before. These are all little indicators that something might be going on behind the curtains. Moving on to onboarding new suppliers. These are the sort of questions to ask because procurement are under pressure to bring on new suppliers. Are the approval processes in place? Are they robust? Is the process being followed? And if the product doesn't meet specification, what's your risk tolerance, and who has the authority to sign off on that risk? And also consider employing a testing strategy to mitigate that risk. Moving on. So sector intelligence, get your antenna up, find out whether competitors have had an incident, also get reliable intelligence from a variety of sources and corroborate that information. Focus more on risk type and whether the vulnerability has increased, and beware of those sensationalist headlines. Get behind them and establish the facts. Thank you, Erica. That brings us to our Q&A.
Thanks, Richard. And yeah, we've got quite a few questions in the chat box. If you do want to ask any questions whilst we're going through these, just enter those in the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can today. And also for the delegates on the call, do remember that handouts are available. So we've got a white paper on food fraud. We've also got something on food safety culture and a little bit on training. And I'll ask the first question. So a question from what we had earlier was, what's the panel's view on the effectiveness of remote audit?
I'll take that one, Erica. Thank you. We're finding that remote audits can be remarkably effective once you get over the technology piece, which in fact is very, very easy to use. Both the auditee and the auditor really settle into it very well. And there are different levels of remote audit that can be conducted. Simply from using a Zoom meeting rather like this, or a smart audit using a phone, through to wearables that we use that are very, very useful. And at the top end, of course, where it's appropriate, we would use drones. But we're finding that the industry is actually very receptive to them. Retailers particularly like them for second-party audits. And as I say, when things settle down, which they will, it'll become all normal and part of a blended solution that will bring the food industry more up to date with other sectors like medical and aerospace.
Okay, we've had another question. Well, we've had a few other questions. Richard, this one might be for you, so might direct that one to you right now. So what VASP traceability audit requirements does the Kite Mark require to be in place that are not already required by GFSI schemes? Okay,
that's a great one. Well, a Kite Mark assessment. Well, first of all, the Kite Mark program looks at independently verifies the supply chain nodes. It integrates best practice when it comes to auditing. So that is a semi-unannounced audit. Semi meaning, well, the auditee can actually say, well, there's no point in coming on Christmas Day or when it's seasonally unavailable. And it also integrates the latest science and testing protocols to verify the product. So the audit itself does not concern itself with food safety. That is more than adequately catered for by any GFSI benchmark scheme. So what the Kite Mark audit is concerned about is verifying the consumer promise, the promise that has been made by the organization. It could be carbon neutrality, for example. It could be the purity of the honey. There are all sorts of different claims that can be made. So we're validating those particular claims, and that isn't going to be supported by a GFSI scheme. So we're concentrating on separation, segregation, traceability, transparency, sampling, and testing. And of course, within the program, we have the ability to collect product from supermarket retail shelves and buy products online and submit those for sampling. And for those of you that are on from enforcement, that really just completes that circle of independent verification.
Excellent. Thanks, Richard. And whilst we've still got the poll open, just remind you of the options: remote audit technology, online training on food fraud, HACCP and GMP, food safety culture, food assurance kite mark, or other. So that might include, if you've got anything that you want to ask Vera, please fill that in so that we can get that over to them. There's a question here that I think might be quite suited to either James or Adrian from Farah. What factors should be considered for food contact packaging manufacturers? So I'm assuming that's relating to testing.
Yeah, I can take that one, Erica, if you like. So we have a whole department at Farah that looks after food safety testing in relation to contact materials. And the latest thing, just to say on the theme of emerging risks, the latest thing in the packaging sector is around bio-based and biodegradable packaging materials and what the safety risks are around those. So the packaging migration studies that we do at the moment focus mainly on chemical migration from plastics, but there's a whole range of different things that we need to consider for bio-based materials. Obviously a very positive thing and going to be the future in terms of having packaging material that we can compost and what have you, but that does mean that it's likely that there's going to be some degradation of the packaging material into the food. So but I would say that's a primary consideration at the moment, above and beyond the environmental and the innovation that's required to get the packaging materials into a form that's suitable for its use. Then the migration of biochemicals from bio-based materials into food is definitely very high up the list of priorities at the moment.
Okay, and this might be another one for you, Adrian, because I know that you've spoken about blockchain before. We've got have the speakers heard of blockchain used to mitigate food fraud? How does that work? So probably won't be able to go into full details of how that works, but Adrian, could you give a little bit of an overview?
I'm going to defer that one to Richard, actually, because he's much more of an
Yes, I'll take that one. So blockchain has been really hyped about being a wonder bullet to solve everything. But of course, it is actually an enabler. It does help. But of course, if you've got wrong information going in, then you'll have wrong information going out. But it's certainly one of the tools that the industry can consider. But it's not a magic bullet.
Thanks. And yeah, I think we can get another couple of questions in before we close for the day. And if we don't answer your question, we will get back to you on email or by call. So we've got one here. Is it possible to distinguish free-range eggs from other eggs? Are there any markers?
I will take that one. Free-range versus not really, no. The issue in the UK, free-range eggs and barn eggs, there's no real chemical difference between them. So I've been asked to look at this before and I've not been able to find anything. And if anybody out there in the audience can think of a chemical reason why they should be different, we can lightly measure it, but I can't think of a justifiable reason why they should be different, and therefore there shouldn't be any real difference between them.
We did do just to add to that, actually, just something very interesting. This is where we have to take a pragmatic view to food authenticity. So one of the issues is the definition of what's free range. So free range chickens only have to have access to outside, and by nature chickens don't necessarily want to go outside. So quite often they won't take up their opportunity. But so knowing that, but what can we do and what can we address? The study we were involved in was looking at battery farmed chickens versus well, not quite free range, but barn free roaming chickens, shall we say. And it came down to the easiest way to be able to tell whether the eggs had been battery farmed was to look for rifling marks on the outsides of the eggs as they come down the metal platforms for collection. So while we've got mass spectrometers and NMRs, one of the important things in food authenticity is to stay connected to the processes that are used, and that's part of the assurance schemes that we developed to understand the processes.
Great, thanks, Adrian. And one last question. I think, Richard, you might be able to help with this. So someone said that their group buyer has asked if there's any sort of system like Trustpilot that he can use to see if suppliers are genuine.
Okay, so yes, so buyers very often want to verify that the company that they're dealing with is actually genuine and not some front company or a parallel supplier. So certainly at BSI, we have the Verify profile, which is an independently verified system which verifies the credentials of that company. So we've actually been there and verified that it's real people, real products, real processes, and a legitimate business. And that is accessible freely online through the Verify directory.
Okay, great. Thanks, Richard. I think we'll close our Q&A for today. Back to Richard to close the webinar, and thank you to all of the presenters today for their great insights, and of course to the delegates for your very interesting and thought-provoking.
Good, thank you, Erica. And we've had hundreds of people on today, and as we wrap up, I hope you've enjoyed this session as much as we have, and leave you with these 7 key points that you will find hopefully useful. Recognize that all the risk factors for food fraud are elevated. There's no hard evidence that food fraud has increased, not yet. Revisit and update your VASAP plans and install staff training. Consider an appropriate testing strategy. Verify your claims and customer promise. Be able to tell your supply chain story, and that's exactly where we started at the very beginning, and of course to remain vigilant. And moving on, I'd just like to extend my sincere thanks to my friends in the industry, Karen Averstein from Discernis, Quincy, of course, from SSAFE, and Professor John Spink in the US from Michigan State University, and last but certainly not least, Salvarani Elahai. And we've been asked already if we're going to be rerunning an update of this seminar in the next quarters, which we definitely will. And thank you very much for your attendance and interest today. Thank you, Erica. Moving on.
Brilliant. Thanks all. Thanks, James. Thanks, Adrian and Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you.